This is the morning brief from the Economic Times.
I have to buy a new car, but I'm confused. Should I buy an electric vehicle or a petrol car? EVs may have a charging infrastructure issue, but petrol prices are hurting quite a lot. Plus, there is this guilt of polluting the environment.
How about I tell you that with the recent announcement by the Government of India, you can somewhat lay that guilt to rest.
आज हमने पेट्रोल में 20% इथेनॉल ब्लेंडिंग के लक्ष्य को 2025 तक पूरा करने का संकल्प किया है।
This does sound to be a cool move. But will this be enough?
Well, India is already mixing 10% ethanol with petrol and aims to increase it to 20%, also known as E20. Not only will ethanol blending reduce emissions by 41%, but also help bring down India's oil import bill by an estimated figure of over 30,000 crore or $4 billion. The move to increase ethanol blending to 20% has some clear advantages, but not without its share of challenges and concerns.
All this and much more is what we are going to find out in today's episode. It's Thursday, 16th of June. From the Economic Times, I'm Kiran Somvanshi.
And I'm Kalpana Pathak, and you are listening to Will Ethanol Sweeten India's Oil Import Bill on the Morning Brief. Do tune in to ET Play, our latest platform for all audio content, including the Morning Brief. In this episode, we analyze the E20 roadmap with our guests from industry and policy think tanks.
But honestly, Kalpana, before we deep dive into the E20 development and its implications, I would like to get my fuel chemistry right. The what, the why, and the where of ethanol.
Kiran, ethanol or ethyl alcohol is a fuel made from various plant materials like fermented sugarcane juice or food grains like maize, corn, or rice. Ethanol is high in oxygen content, which also allows engines to burn fuel completely and lower emissions. A fun fact, Kiran, is that ethanol was first prepared synthetically in 1825 by Michael Faraday, the father of electric motor, and it was first used as an automotive fuel in 1908.
Well, this definitely gets us started. But why is blending ethanol with petrol so important for India? That's the question we posed to our guest Milind Patke from GPS Renewables.
India imports almost 85% of its crude requirement. Petrol and diesel are the main fuels. When you compare with the developed world, the per capita consumption of India in terms of petrol and diesel is pretty low. And therefore, you will see that almost 9 to 10% of petrol growth after the pandemic is over will be recorded, which is very huge. So, next 5 to 10 years, if you look at it, despite electric vehicles coming in, there will be a huge growth of petrol in India. And if that happens, then obviously your imports are going to go up, which means it's not a good news. The second part is, of course, the climate part. Climate part, you all are aware of our commitments in the COP25 and subsequent commitments that our Prime Minister has made. When you replace 10% or 20% of petrol with ethanol, you're definitely doing two things. One is you're reducing your import bill to that extent. And second, of course, is that you're reducing the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So that is why ethanol blending is very important for a developing country like India.
Karthik Ganesan from the Council of Energy, Environment and Water expressed similar insights.
One is, if you look at the composition of who is consuming petrol in the economy, it is slowly but surely moving in the direction of the four-wheelers, right? In 2012, that number was about 36% of the overall petrol was four-wheelers. Today, it's about 40%. Because two-wheelers, obviously, there's aspirational growth of people moving out of two-wheelers to four-wheelers. So that really speaks to this point about, how growing aspirations are going to drive petrol consumption going forward in heavier duty vehicles, right? Four-wheelers as opposed to two-wheelers. And this means that we are setting ourselves up for increased import dependency. Alongside other measures to curtail fossil fuel dependence, whether it is electric vehicles, which is predominantly the pathway that we're looking at post 2030. In the interim, to secure ourselves from the vagaries of the global market, we've all seen the price go up from 70 rupees to about 100 in a span of just literally 6-7 months. And it's important that we have ethanol blending play an important role. And ethanol, at the end of the day, if you look at the notified price today, of course, that will also continuously keep going up with the notified, with the cost of inputs, is about 25-30% cheaper than petrol on a liter to liter basis.
So, is there a conclusive proof that ethanol blending helps reduce emissions?
Well, the emissions do come down by 41%, and this is what Milind shared.
When we talk of the emissions, we talk about net emissions on a life cycle basis. That means from the time you've grown the sugar cane, then you've brought it to the factory, then you've taken out the sugar, then you've taken out the molasses, you've distilled it, made ethanol, transported ethanol to the oil company, and then it is blended with petrol. The entire life cycle, if you look at it, it is the carbon emissions are reduced to the extent of 41%. There is definitely a proof of that. Now, you would say that no, but ethanol moves in tank lorries which burn diesel. Yeah, that is true. And that is the reason today oil companies are experimenting with transporting blended ethanol petrol through pipelines. We already have a huge pipeline network in the country, and we are learning from the Brazil experience. And the Brazil experience says that more the ethanol percentage, actually less is the corrosive effect on the pipelines. As we increase our blending percentage, there is a case for moving the ethanol blended petrol more and more through pipelines or through electricity run trains or the wagons, rail wagons. So, which means even that 41% emission reduction can go up when you further reduce the transportation through fossil fuel.
But the moot question is whether ethanol is as efficient as petrol? Milind shared his insights.
Our current engines are not meant for ethanol blended petrol because all the vehicles which are manufactured in the country in India after 2008 are material compatible, which means they can take ethanol, there won't be any corrosion, etc. But engine wise, they are not compatible even for 10%. And that is why we are seeing the efficiency getting sacrificed, the mileage is getting sacrificed. That is why if your car was giving a mileage of 10 or 11 with the neat petrol, with ethanol, it may give slightly less. But then you can't blame automakers for it because we as a nation, we're not fully aware that we will be able to make so much of ethanol available across the country. The oil marketing companies also till about a year back would not have imagined that they can reach 10%. And therefore, to counter that only, the automakers are now coming up with engine designs which will give you the same mileage, but we'll have to wait.
So, Kiran, you still have to wait for a couple of more years to get an efficient hybrid or flexi fuel car or an affordable EV.
Yeah, but is lower efficiency the only challenge to contend with, or do we have more bumps on the road?
There's a much bigger challenge in India. You have only UP, Maharashtra, Karnataka producing sugar-based ethanol, whereas you require ethanol uniformly across the country because petrol is consumed across the country in the nook and corner of the country. So everywhere, wherever petrol is sold, ethanol has to be available. Today, you have to move product from all points. So automakers were not having this confidence in last 2 to 3 years. They may have now this year they have the confidence that yes, we can launch a vehicle which is engine compatible for E10 and E20, and so obviously the R&D takes time, and therefore they have given the time limit of 2024. The second thing is they are also planning to launch flex fuel vehicles, maybe 3 years, 4 years, 5 years down the line. When we go for E20, suddenly you will find some states are having enough ethanol, some states do not have enough ethanol. So, what does a vehicle owner like you and me do? So, probably then you will have oil marketing companies dispensing E10 for older vehicle, E20 for new vehicles, and the flex fuel vehicles can take anything from 0 to 100.
Well, Karthik does not seem very optimistic about this.
There's a big stock of existing vehicles. Let's remember that, right? Especially of two-wheelers. There are almost 18 crore two-wheelers in this country. The existing stock of two-wheelers, which account for 60% of the petrol consumption in the economy, are nowhere close to compatibility. So E10 and above are going to have a detrimental impact. And I think it's a bit premature in India to sort of look at flex fuel. And in any case, the two-wheeler market, given that it consumes 60% of the fuel and given that the total cost of operation of electric-based options is much more conducive, we should possibly look at, that switch to electric-based instead of perhaps going, the very aggressive route of, replacing more petrol through ethanol.
That's quite a lot of challenges, Kalpana.
Definitely a lot to contend with, Kiran. In fact, in March, the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis published a report which showcased that how accelerating uptake of EVs is a better idea. I spoke with Charles Worringham, an independent energy researcher from Australia who authored that report, about how the same goals are reached by using a fraction of the land.
The oil import bill, which India has each year, is very big. And the ethanol blending policy has one of its aims to try to address that by the substitution of the 20% ethanol blending target. So that's one of the principal goals. But if one looks back at the original justification for the policy, then in addition to the saving of foreign exchange, there are questions of energy security, lower carbon emissions, better air quality, greater self-reliance, employment generation, and so on. So there's a range of different goals. And these are very important goals. The question, however, is whether the ethanol blending policy is necessarily the best way to achieve those. The reason why I have some concerns about this policy is that there may actually be better alternatives. So, for example, the fact that India has the capacity now to manufacture batteries, to manufacture solar panels at scale, and therefore to bring domestically a lot of production that may otherwise have been overseas, there's the potential for India to cut its import bill by the powering of additional electric vehicles as an alternative, potentially, to the benefits brought about by ethanol. The major comparison which I undertook in the report was to look at the distance which can be achieved by growing ethanol in the quantities which are envisaged in the ethanol roadmap. And those are set out year by year up to the year 2025. And there's been a target that's been brought forward to achieve E20 in a much shorter time frame than had originally been envisaged. And the comparison would be with the use of land, instead of growing additional crops to produce the ethanol, or diverting existing cropland from food and fodder production to ethanol production as a fuel. One were to look at the use of land for solar to recharge the batteries of an equivalent set of electric vehicles. One can then get some idea of the quantities of land required to achieve each. And the basic finding of my analysis was that it's actually very, very much more land efficient for India to look at increasing the quantity of solar recharged electric vehicles as opposed to the petrol, the ethanol blending policy, with respect to the amount of distance that actually will be achieved per unit of land. And we're talking here about hundreds of times more efficient in terms of land use for EV recharging than growing crops for ethanol.
So while India invests in the long-term goal of EV vehicles, is ethanol blending a stopgap arrangement to cut down our import bill?
The ethanol blending policy has merit. As a short-term measure, again, a limit on that is that the investment in the additional distillation infrastructure, the investment and the logistics involved in the conversion of the vehicle fleet to accommodate E20 basically is a fairly long-term proposition. So if it's only really as a stopgap measure, one has to question whether it's truly worthwhile. Because the more one invests in ethanol blending, in a sense, the more one is encouraging the perpetuation and the prolongation of the life of the internal combustion engine. So in a way, it delays the inevitable transition to some extent. The enhanced ethanol blending target works against the uptake of electric vehicles.
That's interesting. Ethanol blending seems to be at loggerheads with the country's EV goals. Kalpana, I'm curious. If ethanol blending is such a challenging issue, then how did Brazil achieve success in this area and have flexi fuel cars? Didn't the food versus fuel debate bother them?
That's a good question, Kiran. In fact, Brazil has one of the most successful ethanol programs in the world because one, it has less population and more land compared to India, and two, there is ample rainfall for sugar cultivation. In India, sugarcane is not just a rainfall dependent crop but needs water from other sources too. So it may not be possible to replicate the Brazilian model here, but we can still move the blending up from 10% to 20%. Brazil has almost 46% of its petrol replaced by ethanol. If that happens in India, its fuel import bill can come down drastically and give us cleaner air.
But what about the food versus fuel debate here in India? We do not want food security and energy security to become competing goals. How is it advisable to use food based biofuel for cutting down our oil imports?
That does remain a concern. As Charles says, that the problem is not ethanol from sugar, but from food grains.
We have to factor in issues of food security, recalling that India still has a somewhat precarious food supply situation and has slipped down in the World Hunger Index, regrettably, in the last report. And one of the factors that the authors of the roadmap put forward is that there's the capacity to absorb surplus production to make ethanol. And that's reasonably clear for sugar, but it is much less clear in the case of grains. And the roadmap suggests that as much as 30,000, at least in the most pessimistic scenario in which stocks are inadequate, surpluses are not adequate. And one looks at maize as the major grain that is being suggested to produce ethanol. In fact, most of the additional ethanol would come from grain rather than from sugar. As much as 30,000 square kilometers could be required, which is fully 1/3 of the entire area sown under maize currently in the country. So this is a significant diversion of land towards fuel production as opposed to food and fodder production.
Milind explains in detail how the government is trying to manage the surplus sugar by converting into ethanol production. But he has a contrasting opinion from Charles when it comes to the food versus fuel debate.
See, India produces surplus sugar year on year basis. Now, what does India do with this surplus sugar? India exports. Now, this export has been going on for quite some time, and the Indian government is giving a subsidy so that the exporters are able to match the price in the international market and export successfully. Because ultimately, you need to deal with the surplus. Now, what has happened suddenly is that, as per the commitment in WTO, from 2024 calendar year, this entire sugar subsidy would be withdrawn. When the sugar subsidy is withdrawn, what does India do with this surplus sugar? So, the best way to do it is government thought in its wisdom that to divert the feedstock to manufacturing ethanol. And now, so then there was a problem that if you want to manufacture ethanol, you would almost get equivalent of 360 crore liters of ethanol instead of getting 60 lakh tons of sugar. So that was fitting well with the plans. But then we didn't have so much of distillation capacity in the country. So India then asked people to set up more and more distillation capacities in the country, and that is how it has been planned that the overall capacity would go up to about 600, 700 crore liter, mainly from sugarcane. If we talk of E20, we require 1,000 crore liters. So balance would come from grain and rice. Rice, already there is a 3-year to 4-year surplus stock in the country. Therefore, surplus rice can be used for manufacturing ethanol. Similarly, sugar cane is a water intensive crop. Rice is also a water intensive crop. Maize is the least water intensive. And therefore, Niti Aayog has successfully taken up this message across to farmers saying that you need to now switch to sugarcane to rice and rice to maize. Therefore, I don't think there is any food versus fuel debate at this point in time. Next 3 to 4 years of sufficient ethanol capacities will come in the country, and there won't be any food related issue because already we are dealing with surpluses. After that, yes, it remains to be seen. If we have a bad monsoon, especially, or if we have huge flood or drought related issues in one or two states, especially UP, Maharashtra, then there could be a worry, at least in the short term, but not in the long term.
Karthik also echoed the concerns over climate change disrupting the supply of ethanol.
I would be a little cautious in looking at the seasonality and the vagaries of climate and the way it could impact. See, unlike, for instance, production from petroleum, which is an imported commodity, which is not necessarily influenced by climatic factors. So, drought is not going to impact your supply. Whereas 1 year's drought could basically mean you don't have ethanol to blend, right?
Well, no doubt reaching a 20% blending target in the next 3 to 4 years is an ambitious one. On one hand, it has the potential to save India $4 billion in its fuel import bill and make its air cleaner. But on the other hand, there is no denying that it could threaten India's food and water security, especially in the light of climate change. The question is, can alternatives to this ambitious E20 plan be looked at? When the country is racing ahead full throttle to be a leader in alternative energy sources, especially solar, it is imperative that efforts on that front are expedited. A greater share of renewable sources of power will help India not only reduce its oil import bill and lower emissions, but also keep the food versus fuel debate at bay.
Well, as a consumer, this E20 roadmap doesn't excite me much. I've decided to go for an electric car, probably a year later, by when the charging infrastructure may be widely available.
You have been listening to Will Ethanol Sweeten India's Oil Import Bill? With me, Kalpana Pathak.
And me, Kiran Somvanshi.
On the Morning Brief. Thank you, Milind, Karthik, and Charles for joining us with your insights. This episode was produced by Surabhi Modi from The Economic Times and Soundarya Jayachandran from Awaaz. Sound editors Rajas Naik from The Economic Times and Varun Kapahi from Awaaz. Executive producer Arijit Barman. We hope you like this episode. Do share it on your social media networks. The Morning Brief drops every Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday. Have a great week ahead. All the clips used in this episode belong to their respective owners. Credits mentioned in the description.